What if the United States is fighting a trade war it can't win? Not because it's weaker, but because the game itself is rigged by design. Every tariff, every export ban, every headline about beating China sounds tough until you realize the global economy doesn't play by those rules. China isn't just a rival, it's built into the wiring of how the world makes moves and sells things. Prices rise, factories reroute, and the same products sneak back through new borders, regardless of if there's tariffs on China or not. This isn't a story about victory. It's a story about how global trade finds a way around every wall we build. What you're about to see will change the way you think about power, money, and the future of the world economy. The latest round of tariffs was sold as the blow that would tilt the ledger, yet the ledger keeps finding balance. Costs reappear in different columns. Traded goods reroute through new ports, and the policy cycle ends up repeating with even more restrictions. In 2024, Washington raised duties on a narrow but strategic set of Chinese goods: electric vehicles, batteries, solar cells, and some semiconductors, framing the move as necessary industrial defense. And Beijing, in turn, tightened export controls on minerals needed for those same technologies. Both sides claimed this time things would finally change, that the new tariffs would finally fix the trade imbalance and force the other to back down. But like past rounds, both economies quickly adjusted. Factories shifted routes, companies changed suppliers, and consumers still paid the higher prices. The result was the same pattern repeating. But the macro data? It shows the same pattern of diffusion rather than defeat. In other words, things are just changing and nobody's winning. The question is not whether tariffs bite, of course they do, but why the bite rarely lands where it's supposed to, and why a win becomes so elusive in a supply chain that has spent 2 decades learning how to go around walls rather than through them. US data still places China among the largest partners in goods, while China remains the world's dominant manufacturer by value added, which means even when the US cuts direct imports, Chinese inputs are often embodied in products arriving from elsewhere. The trade gap between the US and China might look smaller, but overall trade deficits with the rest of the world stay the same. The reality is, instead of eliminating trade with China, we're just inserting a more expensive middleman as the goods route through other countries. When you zoom out to the global system, trade growth, investment cycles, and shipping capacity, the picture that emerges is not conquest, but costly rerouting. And the way this trade war is understood depends a lot on where you get your news. For example, look at these 2 headlines. Same quote from Trump, totally different stories. This isn't random. It's what's called framing. And it makes it hard to understand what is really happening in the trade war. That's why I use ground news. And I've used it every single day for the last several years in order to make sure that when I make content for you, it is actually balanced. Seeing the balanced picture here is exactly the point. Perception shapes policy, and behind every headline is real numbers, real prices, and real trade-offs. And balance and the global backdrop matters here, because it sets the ceiling for what tariffs can achieve. And the latest WTO outlook shows world trade rising more slowly than pre-pandemic norms, while policy uncertainty and front-loading distort quarterly swings. Modeling by the OECD warns that aggressive reshoring and high barriers reduce trade and GDP substantially in affected economies. So this isn't just about China and the US, it's about the entire world. And the choice here isn't resilience or openness, but which combination of spreading production and setting fair trade rules can achieve both goals. History not only suggests, but proves that self-isolating shrinks the pie before anyone can claim a bigger slice. Just think about North Korea as an example, a self-isolated country that has one of the worst economies in the world. The more a country isolates, the more they move to being more like North Korea and less like what made the United States amazing. Okay, now let's talk about all the factors that play into this, because the first factor to understand is how tariffs affect prices. And there is perfectly good and very recent data on this. In the 2018-2019 trade fight, data clearly showed what happened in the short run. Prices on targeted imports didn't fall enough to offset the tariffs. So duty-inclusive prices rose and U.S. importers and consumers bore most of the cost. Two complementary studies by completely different journals, one in the Quarterly Journal of Economics and the other in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, estimate near complete pass-through. So in other words, the cost was borne completely by consumers, and measure reductions in real income as a result. So in other words, the tariffs and the pass-through of the costs essentially reduce the real income and the spending power of Americans, making life in general more expensive. And the economics here aren't ideological or political, they're just plain math. And the same logic still applies here today, unless other countries can quickly increase production to fill the gap, which takes a lot of time and money. And it also takes an appetite to fill that gap, because who's to say that the trade war doesn't go away 6 months or a year from now, and those countries that created the infrastructure to fill the gap aren't going to be left holding the bag when China and the US potentially start to play nice again. A second mechanism is fiscal. Tariff revenue can look large in nominal terms, 50 billion here, 100 billion there. But relative to the scale of the economy, it's small, it's volatile, and ultimately not paid by foreigners in any mechanical sense. Treasury data shows custom duties jumping after 2018. Then they went up and they went down depending on government policies and how much was being imported. Even recent spikes leave duties in minor share of receipts, and their growth often coincides with higher consumer prices on affected categories. Put differently, tariffs are a narrow tax on specific baskets, not a broad replacement for income or payroll taxes. The Fed, which is the statistical division of the Federal Reserve, its index for U.S. import prices from China is still below its mid-2010s baseline and has posted year-over-year declines as recently as mid-2025. Yet monthly swings reflect both tariff episodes and product mix changes. The more you shift categories, the more you manipulate the index without necessarily reducing embedded Chinese content. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. This is why headline price stabilization can mask higher costs within targeted subsectors. And it's also why firms care more about relative rather than absolute import price moves. A third mechanism is the structure of production. A large share of exports are actually re-exports of value-added products that are created elsewhere, which means restricting a bilateral lane, think China versus the US, often just reassigns rather than removes Chinese imports. That's why garment shipments from Vietnam or electronics from Mexico can show rising Chinese intermediate content, even as the US reports lower direct imports from China. The supply chain is many to many, not one to one. Now, reshoring, which is the practice of moving manufacturing back to the US, it can reduce exposure to this. But the OECD warns that pushing too far raises costs without actually making the system stronger or more stable. And what's the point of adding jobs at home if we're just going to increase the prices of everything exponentially and the real incomes of all Americans go down? Now, in addition to that, the Federal Reserve finds that as the US de-risks from China, other US suppliers have quietly increased their reliance on Chinese imports. So in other words, rather than the goods going directly from China to the US, they're going to places like Mexico and Vietnam and then getting imported into the US. And the New York Fed argues that official data understates true US imports from China because small package exemptions and creative invoicing let much of this trade slip under the radar. So even if official records show fewer imports from China, the actual amount of Chinese-made parts in global products stays about the same. That means tariffs might make trade numbers look better on paper, but they don't really reduce how much the US economy still depends on Chinese supply chains. Now, policy can change that in theory, but only with painstaking rules on origin, data, and enforcement, which is probably something that is beyond even possible for the US to even comprehend or implement. And a final systemic gear here is finance. The dollar still anchors official reserves and payments, and this isn't changing anytime soon, even if the China is shoring up its gold reserves. IMF data shows that more than half of global reserves are still held in US dollars, Well, China's currency makes up only a small single-digit share of global payments. And not only that, even though they have increased their gold reserves still pale in comparison to what the US holds. In fact, if you combine all of the countries on Earth and combine all of their gold, it still pales in comparison to what's on reserve in the US. This imbalance means China has limited power to affect US borrowing costs, while the US can still influence most international transactions. In simple terms, the world still trades in dollars and likely will for the foreseeable future. So when tariffs raise prices, those costs ripple across the global economy in US dollars. The way the financial system is built reduces the chance of direct financial conflict, but spreads the economic effects of trade tensions everywhere. So let's take a look at a few examples here. Consider solar. For 2 years, the US paused new duties on modules routed through Southeast Asia to avoid supply shocks. In other words, the US needed solar, so they avoided all duties in order to get the things that they needed. But that moratorium lapsed in June 2024, and by April 2025, the US Department of Commerce announced its final decision on anti-dumping and countervailing duty investigations on Cambodia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. Imports didn't stop as a result. They just repriced, relabeled, and concentrated among firms with lower assessed rates, while project developers raced to certify or consume inventory before the deadlines. The outcome was more cost, more paperwork, and a supply map that still traced back to China. Tariffs changed the path to market, not the physics of the electrons. Then there's semiconductors. US rules restrict China's access to high-end chips and certain tools, and those controls keep tightening. These measures push Chinese firms towards domestic alternatives and multi-country workarounds, while US and allied firms face higher compliance costs and slower equipment sales into China. The system adapts, but not without friction that ripples through the markets. Instead of cutting all ties in chip production, the change is gradual. The US and China are slowly adjusting where chips are designed and made, but both still compete fiercely in the middle levels of the semiconductor industry, where most production happens. Critical minerals show a similar story from China's side. In 2023, Beijing put limits on exports of gallium, germanium, and graphite, key materials used to make chips and batteries. The goal wasn't to stop exports completely, but to control how much and where they went. These new rules pushed other countries to start doing more of the processing themselves. They started stocking up on materials and looking for alternatives. Still, because China controls most of the world's processing capacity, everyone remains dependent on Chinese supply. Governments can try to slow down that reliance with new policies, but in the end, it takes years and major investment to open new mines or build refineries. Agriculture goes to an extreme and shows how trade retaliation works in real life. China is the biggest buyer of US soybeans, but when tariffs increase or Brazil has a large harvest, Chinese companies quickly switch to buying from Brazil or other countries. That leaves US farmers with extra supply and lower prices as they try to find new buyers. Reports from the USDA show that in most years, sales to China make up about half of all US soybean exports. Even small drops in Chinese demand can hit farm income, transportation networks, and processing plants. Not only does it hit them, but it hits them hard. Trade barriers don't erase demand, they just shift where the business goes, and major assets like ports, rail lines, and refineries can adapt overnight. And then if you look at energy trade, it keeps moving no matter what happens politically. In 2024, US oil exports hit record highs, even though sales to China fell by half. Liquefied natural gas shipments shifted between Asian countries, depending on prices and trade rules. If either side added new tariffs, it wouldn't stop energy trade. It would just change where the oil goes and where the gas goes. Because oil is easy to sell globally and liquid natural gas contracts let sellers redirect shipments, trade routes adjust pretty quickly. But ports, refineries, and pipelines can only handle so much. So big changes take time. In short, energy follows profits, not politics. A hidden issue is the rise of online shopping under the de minimis rule. This rule lets small, low-value packages enter the US duty-free, which allows many Chinese goods to skip tariffs and reporting requirements. The number of these shipments has skyrocketed. US Customs processed more than 1 billion of them in 2023 and even more in 2024. In 2025, regulators started closing loopholes and tightening the rules, but it showed how easily trade policies can be bypassed. If tariffs target large shipping containers, companies simply switch to mailing smaller packages instead. To really control imports, the rules need to match how modern e-commerce actually works. In simple terms, these loopholes aren't small. They're a huge part of the trade story. A second hidden gear is triangulation. As U.S. imports from China fell, Mexico became the top U.S. supplier and Vietnam surged. But Federal Reserve research shows that those exporters, Mexico and Vietnam, their own imports from China rose, meaning more Chinese content arrives indirectly. This isn't really a loophole. It's just how global trade naturally works. Countries focus on what they're best at, and production spreads across many connected supply chains. Setting strict rules to slow that process can work, but it's expensive and hard to enforce. The truth is, separating these deep trade networks isn't impossible, but it takes a lot of time, money, and coordination. Capacity also matters. Container freight rates, a proxy for global logistics bandwidth, well, they've fallen sharply, but they bounced back right before the tariffs were introduced. And this is what's called front-loading. American companies brought in more goods from China in order to avoid the future tariffs. But now that the tariffs are in place and boxes and shipping containers are abundant, rerouting is cheaper and tariffs are easier to avoid. The World Container Index clearly shows the 2025 arc, spikes around policy deadlines, then declines as volumes normalize. So in other words, when tariffs are about to go into effect, companies ship more goods to beat the deadline, which increases shipping prices. Those higher shipping prices are immediately followed by reduced shipping prices, which allows countries like China to circumvent tariffs by being able to reroute goods to other countries for cheaper, ultimately with them ending at the exact same destination, the United States. The immediate implication of all of this is on prices and productivity. When tariffs raise input costs, firms either pass them through, compress margins, or re-engineer supply. This is exactly what happened in 2018 and 2019. The pass-through costs were high and real income losses were material. In other words, life got more expensive for Americans. Fed researchers found that factories relying heavily on imported parts tended to perform worse when tariffs raised costs. Governments can offer subsidies to help, but that usually means taxpayers end up paying the bill, which can also make it harder to control inflation. If the goal is to make key industries stronger in the long run, the research suggests using focused industrial policies and clear standards. For example, government programs that support battery manufacturing, renewable energy projects, or semiconductor research, and standards that set clear rules for safety, quality, and sustainability instead of broad tariffs. Simply put, the market responds better to clear, targeted plans than to noisy, one-size-fits-all policies. The broader implication is macro. Global growth projections for 2025 have been revised down in part due to tariff uncertainty and front-loading effects. In other words, the entire global economy is feeling the effect. China and the US aren't the only countries affected here. Regardless of which country announces which tariff, the economic consensus is that tariffs erode investment and productivity unless paired with clear, stable plans for countries and businesses to expand their trade options. The upshot is that winning a trade war looks a lot like slower growth for everyone, with temporary gains for third country exporters and logistics providers. In other words, the countries fighting the trade war never end up on the winning side. There are, however, credible reasons to de-risk in select sectors. Security risks from advanced chips, connected vehicles, or port cranes are not imaginary. And the challenge is to calibrate controls so they impose minimal collateral cost on unrelated sectors. History shows that the most effective strategies are focused and coordinated. Working with allies on export controls, giving temporary support to key industries like clean energy or chips. And enforcing clear trade standards tend to work better than broad tariffs that trigger retaliation. It's complicated political work, but economically, the logic is simple. Smart planning and teamwork build lasting strength. When the goal is stability and resilience, strategy always beats slogans. When people reach for analogies on this, they often land on the 1980s US and Japan tensions. But the difference matters because Japan's export machine was tightly tied to the US economy and the US's security umbrella. And voluntary export restraints could be negotiated bilaterally. Today, China is a hub for value, so restricting one lane sends traffic to others. Studies of the 1980s find sizable costs and limited benefits from the protection in autos and steel. And they remind us that the most enduring fixes came from product standards, competition, and currency diplomacy, not from permanent trade walls. History rhymes here, but supply chains change the rhythm of the story. If we look back even further, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 shows how bad things can get when trade wars spiral. Studies using detailed quarterly data found that other countries retaliated by cutting their imports from the US by as much as 30%. The result made the Great Depression worse by choking international trade. The takeaway isn't that every tariff will cause another 1930s-style collapse, but that sweeping, heavy-handed policies almost always backfire. Short-term wins often turn into long-term problems, slowing recovery and making global trade weaker for years. So, why can't the US beat China in a trade war? Why will they never beat China in the trade war? Because the supply chain is like a network of roadways, and tariffs are like roadblocks. And when a road gets blocked, people just simply detour and reroute around the roadblock. They use different roadways, different highways in order to get where they need to go. But in taking those detours, there are certain parties that are affected negatively, like consumers and small firms, certain parties that benefit, like smaller countries that the goods are being rerouted to. But the benefits, they never fall to the countries that put the roadblocks in place. There is absolutely no winning, no matter what anybody tells you, from participating in a trade war. The practical path forward is not surrender, but strategy. Narrow controls where security risk is high. Investment in domestic capacity where learning curves can be bent, and multilateral standards that reward clean, trusted production. In that regime, winning stops being about forcing a rival to lose and starts being about reducing fragility at home. That's slower than a headline, but it's how the system actually moves. And by the way, myself and YouTube, we both think that you'll love this video next if you want to learn more.